Good evening to everybody. It's good to see a full church, and thank you very much for coming tonight. I think we all by now know the format for the evening. Is this your first time, or you've been here before, right? Okay. So the format for the evening, you can be seated, is going to be very simple. We will begin with a talk, which I will try to keep relatively brief. Roughly 20 minutes-ish. We'll have a few moments of just silent time for adoration, and then you've each received a questionnaire with discussion points that you can talk to your spouse about for about another 5 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap it up with benediction, and then we'll go downstairs and socialize. We'll have the finest selection of wine and cheeses this side of Portchester. So let me just ask you a question, and it's a little bit a rhetorical question, but I think it's good sometimes to ask and then kind of see what answers you give yourselves. You don't have to answer me. It's not like grade school when I do one of the grade school masses here and I ask something rhetorical and the kids are all like, oh. It's like... So, why do you get married in a church? Why bother? It's actually a question that I think a lot of people are asking today, and the short answer for them, because people frequently, if we don't know the answer to that question, the next logical step is, well, what's the point? Why not just shack up? You know, maybe we'll get married in some sort of ceremony because we want the romantic party and the mass, maybe mass, but not necessarily even that, but we want the reception and the white dress and all the perks that go with that. But ask ourselves, why do we get married sacramentally? What good is it? And the short answer, which is kind of where my thought process led me during the preparation, was sacramental grace, okay? Every sacrament that we go to gives us what is called sanctifying grace. Sanctifying grace is what actually makes you holy. Sanctifying grace is, if you want a simple definition, it's kind of like the point of contact between you and God in the human soul. So sacramental grace, it's the thing in your soul that allows you to share in God's life, okay? Actually, one lay definition is just, it is a participation in God's own life. And sacramental grace is kind of that point of contact between you and God, okay? Every sacrament, everything that we do that makes us holy, gives us sacramental grace. But each sacrament also has a particular thing that makes it special, right? The sacramental grace of confession is, you get sanctifying grace, but the particular thing that it does is it forgives you your sins, right? So what in the world is the sacramental grace that matrimony gives to you? Well, hold that thought. Because I bet when you got married, you probably, when you wake up the next morning, look at each other and look at yourself in the mirror, and it's like, I'm still the same person. Nothing changed. Well, I mean, what changed is, I am now, if you're a woman, you've got a new last name. You have a new relationship, if you want, with a person. But when you look at yourself in the mirror, you wake up and you say, did something change? And the temptation would be to say, no. I mean, I'm still the same old, right? Well, the truth is, when you get married, there is a sacramental, it's called a seal. It's like when you get confirmed or you get baptized or ordained a priest for that matter, there's a sacramental seal. It's like a stamp that God puts on your heart. And when you get married, the only difference between marriage and the other ones I just mentioned is that the other ones are eternal. Marriage, that seal is until death do you part. Otherwise, if one of you sadly got widowed, you'd never be able to get married again, right? So the seal is as long as the two of you are alive. So there's something actually that takes a change that takes place in our soul when we get married validly and we have the sacrament. I remember when I was ordained a priest, it's like you wake up and it's like, well, I feel the same today as I did yesterday before I was ordained. And, one of the common things you would hear with the other guys I got ordained with was like, I would have no problem going to confession with you. I have no problem believing that you just got ordained a priest. But if somebody comes to me and asks for confession, that's when you start being like, I don't know if you really want to go there, do you? It's like, and it takes a while. I remember realizing about a year into my priesthood, there's something different, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And all of a sudden one day it just occurred to me, one word, it struck me, it was fatherhood. When you become a priest, there's a change, and it comes down to fatherhood. You look at the world in a different way. Well, the same thing happens in marriage. There's a change that takes place in your soul. Okay? And what it is, fatherhood possibly, eventually, for some of you, 50% of the people get married. That may be the thing. But you get consecrated to be able to live a state of life that does a few different things. I've got these numbers from the Catechism. I have way more preaching material than I need, but I'm just going to try to keep it brief. So, in the Catechism it says, first thing that happens when you get married is you become integrated, you become plugged into, if you want, the covenant between God and man through Jesus Christ. We get plugged into God's entire salvific plan in a very special way. When you get married, it's like you get an extra, it's kind of like you're an extension, or you're one of those power strips with like 6 or 7 outlets on it, Well, you've got different ways you can get plugged in. Well, you just got another one of those outlets filled up with something, okay? You got plugged in a new way. I guess it would be the opposite, though. You would be an outlet that absorbs 6 or 7 plug-ins instead of gives out. So we get plugged into God's covenant with man. And what that basically comes down to is marriage is meant, therefore, to make us holy. The sacrament of marriage is a sacrament that God gives, and it's a very powerful thing, so that instead of killing each other, you actually help each other to become holy. That's kind of like the primary goal of marriage. And I think if you've lived together for any amount of time, and you start to realize once all the angel dust wears off, and then you start to look at each other and see all the things that are annoying, and why does she do that? It's like, whatever. It could be something as dumb as the way you brush your teeth, whatever it is. It's like, there's one particular comedian who's kind of funny, but like most comedians, I can't repeat because some of his jokes are off color, but most of them are quite good. And he was saying, when you first fall in love and it's like everything this person does is just adorable, it could be the most ridiculous thing. It's like, babe, you're beautiful, and then later on, once you're married for a few months, it's like, I hate her. It's just, and it could be something stupid. It could just be the way she clips her nails or whatever it is, but it's just like, okay, well, the sacrament of marriage is going to help us to overcome those things and to grow in holiness. What the sacrament of marriage gives us is, according to the Catechism, 5 bullet points here, it says, gives us the strength to take up our crosses and to follow him. So number 1, it gives you strength to carry the crosses of each other. It gives us, if we have fallen, for example, if we fight, it gives us grace to be able to get back up and to forgive one another. Well, the third point is pretty much the same again. It gives grace to bear one another's burdens. Number 4, the grace to subject oneself to our spouse out of reverence for Christ. So the sacrament of marriage enables us to do what St. Paul said, which is to be subject to one another. To learn, basically that's another way of saying to learn how to die to myself and make myself a gift to the person that I love. And to love the other person with supernatural, tender, and fruitful love. So the question is, how does this play out? Because I think we can ask a simple question. If marriage does all this, when the sacrament of marriage does all this, and I know a lot of people who are Catholics who got married validly in the church, and you could say, how come so many marriages out there are a shipwreck? And they got all that stuff from God, right? And maybe even you look at yourself sometimes and say, well, If we got married in the church and we're trying, and even with all this, we're having a hard time, I mean, what's it all good for, right? Okay, I want to give you a couple of practical points. Here's the problem, and then I'll get to the practical points. The problem is, like so many things in the spiritual life, God gives us gifts, but they need to get activated, so to speak. I'm not particularly engaged in the charismatic renewal, but I have had a lot of contact with it in the last 7 or 8, 9 years of my priesthood. And, for example, if you ever read Father Cantalamessa, he's actually the Pope's preacher. So if you're good enough to preach to 3 popes, one of whom is a canonized saint, you're good enough for the likes of me to read you, right? Father Cantalamessa, who was big in the charismatic renewal from the very beginning, he actually, even though he's Italian, he was actually present at Duquesne in the 70s when they had the big awakening and everything. So he goes way back to the origins. They talk about activation of, the charisms being, speaking in tongues and being able to cure and prophesy and everything. Why don't we all have these things? Well, first of all, they're gifts. But they said a lot of the times the problem is from our baptism, we have the seeds, but they never wake up because we never activate them, right? But I think the same thing is true in our marriages a lot of times. Marriage, the graces of marriage don't just happen. We have to work at it and do our part so that they will start to flourish. So what's that look like? Practically speaking, I'm going to suggest the following. The first point is, if you want, kind of boring. It basically comes down to just everyday holiness and prayer, okay? And what do I mean by that? For us to be able to bear with one another's weaknesses, for us to have the grace and even the desire to kind of not only put up with one another, but to bear the needs and the weaknesses of the other, even if the other is being, quote-unquote, unbearable. We need to be striving towards holiness in just the ordinary aspects of my life. So, for example, do I pray? Something as straightforward as that. Do I pray every day? If I don't pray every day, then my conduit to God is probably not going to be real, let a whole lot of grace through. If we are men and women who as individuals, and even better as a couple, and even better yet as a family, if we have moments where we pray together every single day, we're creating an atmosphere where God's grace can work in our lives, in our marriages. We're creating, if you want, kind of a shield around us from a lot of the darts of the enemy. And we're working consciously, if you want, proactively, in one of the fundamental reasons why we got married in the first place. Not the reason necessarily that we felt, but the reason that God had in mind when we got married in the first place, which is to help each other to become saints. When we get married, we might get married because we feel the attraction. It's like, I just couldn't live without this person. They're so beautiful, etc. And there's nothing wrong with that. But from God's perspective, why did he institute marriage and why did he institute families? It's to help each other become saints. Your fundamental role is to help your spouse to become a saint and let your spouse help you to become a saint and raise children who will become saints. That's the purpose of marriage. That's the purpose of families. It is to create the school of sanctity, if you want. And if we're not living in the state of grace, because sometimes marriages aren't. Sometimes we're doing stuff that is sinful, or we're just, not going to Sunday Mass with any frequency, and we're just cutting ourselves off. If we're not living in the state of grace, then it's like we've got all this hardware in order to become saints, and it's like we got a computer that's not plugged in, or not turned on. It's all ready to go, it's got everything, but it doesn't have the electricity in it, and it's not going to go anywhere, right? So that's going to be the most fundamental thing. Number 2 is, and I'll have to translate this, it's called, I refer to it as leaning into the sacrament, okay? Leaning into the sacrament of matrimony in particular. What do I mean by that? But like I said, matrimony as a sacrament has specific graces it wants to give us. I'm going to give you a little anecdote that I found on the internet, okay? It's from, one of these sites to help you live your marriage better. So there's this young lady writing, "My husband Chris and I emerged from the house." Okay, here's the background is this. She's having a bad day. The kids are misbehaving. It's super hot out. She's uncomfortable, sweating, sweltering. And at the worst possible moment, her husband comes home and picks up some annoying conversation from previously in the day that it just wasn't the right moment, and it's like, ugh, really? Are you going to talk about this now? All right, really? Okay, it's one of those moments. So, my husband Chris emerged from the house and sat down next to me. He jumped right back into the middle of a conversation we had started hours ago regarding some of our family's holiday plans. There was drama to sort out, the cost of different rental options, to inferred feelings of various members based on recent comments. One thing was for sure, I was not in the right mood to participate in this type of conversation. I was on a crash course to saying uncharitable things about Chris and the other family members. Probably none of you can empathize with that, right? Nobody here has ever been in any of those situations. I haven't. But here's the cool thing. Before I opened my mouth, though, I took a second to pray, and what she essentially is doing is she leans into the sacrament of matrimony. She said, "Lord, by the grace of my marriage, empower me with gentleness, patience, and charity toward my husband, because you know that I need them right now." And then things were a little different. What she did was she took stock of the fact, "Lord, I know that when I got married, you gave me a toolkit. You gave me grace. Right now I'm asking you, Lord, help me to dig into that grace right now. Help me to draw from it." What she did was she kind of leaned into the sacrament of matrimony and said, "Lord, I know I've got this. Right now I need you. And from the grace that I know that you gave me, help me right now." And I think, it's a very powerful thing to do. I don't know where she got this inspiration. But it's a very powerful thing to do, to take stock of the gifts and the authority that God gives. When we get married, God gives us a kind of spiritual authority over ourselves, over our children. He gives us a new kind of power, and we're not even aware of it a lot of time. And something as simple as that, just simply saying, "Lord, I claim right now the grace that you want for me in marriage, I claim it. Because it's not because I'm a great person, but because you have promised. You gave me this grace, and I claim it now so that we can grow in holiness and love, and we can overcome this whatever the particular issue is." That's a really powerful thing to do. So that's what I mean by leaning into the sacrament. If we are aware of, and we talk to God, and we even talk to each other, if we keep the idea of what marriage does for us in mind, and we claim it, and we lean on it, you're going to find that there's a well. It's kind of like the Eucharist. A lot of people deal with the Eucharist, practically it's not there, don't even believe it. But when we turn to the Eucharist with faith, hope, and love, and we turn to God and open our hearts to Him, miracles come forth. Well, the same thing is true of our marriage. It's a sacrament. And it's a sacrament that God has used to plug us into Himself very powerfully. Number 3. This one's probably the hardest. I entitled this, "No Secrets and Don't Go to Bed Angry." So what does that mean? You're shaking your head. It looks like it's an impossible thing to ask of you. It can be done. Okay, here's the logic, okay? When you get married, I think the best possible synthesis of what marriage is goes back to the book of Genesis. It comes down to the words, "The two become one." That's actually what Jesus went back to. And he said, when he talked about the fact that marriage cannot be dissolved, there's no divorce, for example, he says, in the beginning, God made them man and woman, and they cleaved to each other, and the two became one. That's the essence of marriage right there, okay? And what that means is unity is essential. But unity is something that it requires intentionality. If we're not intentional about finding ways to be united with my spouse, we'll get into our silos and we'll drift and we'll get into our own worlds, and my husband will go off and be wrapped up in work and negligent about the things in the home, and I will be judging him because he never pays attention to the things that are important to me that I see every day, etc., etc. And you each get into your own galaxies, you know. At least I've been told that it happens somewhere. I don't know, maybe none of you, but I've been told that it can happen. So here's the thing, communication requires intentionality. So when I say no secrets, it means you can't have secrets. Sure, you can have secrets like a surprise birthday party for your spouse because I want to have a nice surprise. Okay, that's not a major secret, and it's something that's going to be revealed, right? I suppose there are moments when you can have secrets in the sense of, you know, say my spouse just really isn't living the faith, and you have things that you want to talk to a priest about, and you know, there can be those kind of things, the things that you bring out in confession that even, you know, really, it's just you and God really are the only ones. But as much as possible, the more there is transparency, the tighter that marriage is going to be. There's three concepts that go very closely together: intimacy, vulnerability, and love. And it works like this. Intimacy doesn't just mean the physical intimacy that we frequently attribute, you know, that's one dimension of it. Intimacy just means this. It means I reveal what is on my inside to you, and you reveal what's on your inside to me. There's a physical dimension of that. We reveal and we share and we unite sexually, physically, but intimacy in its essence means being willing to be vulnerable and expose myself, so to speak. This is who I am. And to trust, and you only do that when the person merits your trust. And we're not just intimate with anybody. There are relationships that it's proper to, and people that merit our trust, and most of the world does not deserve your intimacy because you don't have that relationship. But in a marriage, when the two become one, two hearts need to learn how to share. And if there is no communication, there's not going to be vulnerability, and there's not going to be, therefore, intimacy where two hearts reveal themselves to each other and accept one another with all their lumps and warts and bumps and wrinkles and all that stuff. And when those things are present, that is where love grows. When we're willing to share intimacy with each other, and I know that I am absolutely accepted for who I am and loved for who I am, even though I've got things that are bad, that are ugly, that are wounds. But I nonetheless know that I can bring those to the person that I'm married to because I know fundamentally they love me unconditionally, even with all the baggage. That is an incredible motor of love. So anyway, I'm already overdue on my talk, so I'm going to wrap things up. But this is why God gave us the sacrament of marriage. It is a sacrament that gives us special graces to be able to unite ourselves to the person to whom we're married, so as to help each other to grow in holiness and to become, if you want, like a little domestic church. And from that, by helping each other to become saints, to learn how to open ourselves to one another, to share that which is deepest within us, and so to grow in love. So anyway, I apologize if this was kind of tonight was particularly theological, but that's what you get. You get a theological title, you get theological talk. So what we're going to do right now, we're going to give you about 5 minutes or so of, I would say, silent adoration, just personal prayer time. And then the illustrious Carolina is going to let you know. Is that the way it works, or is it my job? My job. I will let you know after a few minutes. We'll give you another few minutes just to discuss your printed up questions, and then we'll wrap it up with Eucharistic benediction.